What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Allebach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. I just have one quick announcement before getting into today's episode, and it's that I just launched a new personal blog on Medium, which you can find linked on all my social media pages. I'm planning to start posting chapters on it each week of the book I've been writing on internet culture. A lot of you have been asking how it's going, but for those of you who don't know or haven't been following this whole ordeal, I wrote about like 180 pages of this thing in under 2 months at the end of last year, which was just like throwing paint on a canvas, you know? So now I'm going through it piece by piece and trying to refine things, and I'm going to start putting all of it out there for feedback. So keep an eye out for those posts if you're into it. Anyway, now for today's episode, I got to chat with Kimeko McCoy. Kimeko is a social media editor that currently works with Adweek, and she's also a journalist, content producer, and a bunch of other stuff. I say this all the time, you can't ever fit who someone is into a bio, you know? It's impossible. We covered all sorts of ground in this conversation. We got into a bit of Kimeko's personal career story, talked about how brands on social media are interacting with each other right now. We got into the topic of race and diversity in industries specifically like advertising, where we work in, the toxicity of hustle culture. Gary V, if you're listening to this, you're part of the problem. So stupid. I'm trying to think. What else? We also talked about how to just stay healthy online in general, while also trying to bridge understanding between cultural divides and engaging people with views outside of our own, you know? So we both kind of share in this cynicism of just trying to balance being hopeful with all this stuff, you know? Like, it's a lot sometimes. So, and I felt bad toward the end just because I asked Kimeko a lot of questions that are like impossible to answer, but she was phenomenal and offered a ton of really great insights. Quick final note, there was a bit of a delay in the recording, which made certain transitions just a little bit sticky, but overall it came out great, and I really hope you all enjoy it. Now let's get into what's really good. Kimeko, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Not a problem. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun time. There's a ton that I want to get into with you, but just to give myself and the listeners some context to who you are, since this is the first time you and I are talking, I figure we can just start here. So initially, what got you into writing and the whole creative field in general?
So I have two stories, actually. So the first story I tell you is a story that's like professional. I had to do a senior project back in high school where we had to like pick a field that we were interested in.
Mm-hmm. Classic.
And mine was writing. So I like stalked around a newsroom for a little while, and I was just like the feeling that you like. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is one of my favorites. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10. But one of the moments is that the whole premise of the movie is that like when she goes to Tiffany's, like a very calming, relaxing, like fulfilling feeling that she gets. And when I've walked into a newsroom, like I felt that same way. I only feel that other way about like Publix and Target. But that's my professional thing. But what happened before that is I saw Anchorman with Ron Burgundy, and I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. News, that's it.
I love how you have to split it between your like a personal story and a professional story, because
Exactly. People ask me this and I have to answer them so that they'll hire me.
I feel like if you were in a professional situation and you said the Anchorman version of the story and they didn't hire you, that you wouldn't want to work for them anyway.
Honestly, I agree.
So, I mean, like, as far as like your own personal interests, what are some of the things that you're most passionate about writing? And like, has that evolved over the years since high school?
Yeah, I actually graduated with a journalism degree and minored in creative writing. So I do like fiction narrative stories. But as far as like journalism, I started my career as a feature writer, actually, and I really, really, really like telling the stories of like marginalized voices. Some of the favorite stories that I've done are about like, housing developments for low income residents that were like, I don't want to disguise as like a terrible choice of word, but I can't think of another one. But they were kind of made to be like a normal suburban home. So like you wouldn't know by driving by that it was a low income area. And I got to talk to some of the families and their struggles and whatnot. And I think just being able to like interact with different people and like highlight their voices meant a lot to me. So those are probably my favorite stories to tell and kind of what I honed in on. Minority voices, women voices, people of color and things like that.
Yeah, I saw on your website, or maybe it was when I was Googling you, I forget where I saw it exactly, but where you had done a project in Atlanta with, like it was, I forget if it was one band or if it was a few bands, or it was like an all black women, like indie rock band or something like that. And you covered that, which I thought was really, really cool.
Yes, that was the first story that I did. I think The Tulips is their name. And they were a super dope all-female rock band. One of them had like green dreads. It was amazing. But yeah, the next story that I did that was a follow-up to that actually was like another rock band, but they also put on events. But this was more geared toward like people who were into like mosh pits. Yeah. And I was standing in the middle of a mosh pit with brown faces all around me and like being ready to be in tears. And just like the majestic of it. Like,
that's real journalism. That's what it's all about.
I was like, I have found an entire room of unicorns. Like, I have to tell people about this.
That's amazing, though. No, I love that. It hit me when I read that. I didn't dig too deep into it. I wanted to kind of get your take and hear more about like where you were coming from with all of it. Because prior to getting into writing and social media for myself, music was a big part of what I did. And in recent months, I guess I started doing this last August or so. I started volunteering for this company, or nonprofit. I don't know what they identify as, but it's called So Far. Have you heard of them before?
So Far Sounds?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to a show either this week or next week.
No way.
Yeah. I love them.
Oh my God. That's so cool. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask you like if you were aware of them because I feel like, and obviously, so I'm from outside of Philly, so like it's the Philadelphia So Far crew, and I don't know as much of what's going on like across the world or the country or whatever, but insofar as the So Far team in Philly, it's really cool because like for me, like growing up, I was a big not just songwriter, but I did a lot of promoting in our local like Philly suburb scene. So I was always looking for, different bands, different genres, different people to connect with. And I always found like just from my own personal identity and the resources that I had, it was really hard for me to know where to even find more diverse voices and more diverse acts just because, you know what I mean? Like just the networks we all kind of like move in. Like I was finding a lot of like white dudes playing in punk bands or folk bands or it's like people like me, and I joke about it and I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just a fact. I mean, like someone like me as a indie folk songwriter, it's like and I got a beard and glasses, like I'm a dime a dozen insofar as like the music scene. So I thought it was really cool because that was me growing up, and I always had a tougher time kind of connecting with different areas of diversity in the local music scene. But when I joined the So Far team this past August, one of the things I thought was so cool about it is the emphasis they put on diversity, which to me, it's like, I didn't even know where to start when I was doing this like 7, 8, 9 years ago. And with them, it's like they're doing in Philadelphia, I think like 14 of these shows a month. And every one that I MC, it's like 3 super diverse acts from all over, different genres, different races, different stories. And it's like, it's such a breath of fresh air insofar as like connecting on that local level. So it's like super, super cool that and that you're into that, which is what I wanted to just bring it up because I thought that was a cool little connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I love them. I'm so excited for this show.
How long, like, what got you into that? This is like a total tangent, but we can go here.
I am, I guess you could call me like a busybody. Like, I'm very much like, let's get out of the house. Let's do something. I'm going to do things. I will drag whoever to wherever I feel like there are things happening. And so, like, I don't even know if it was like a social media post or like a Facebook group or where I found it, but I stumbled upon it. This had to be maybe 2 or 3 years ago that I found out about So Far. And ever since then, I've been like applying for tickets every time that they're in town. So this is the first time that I've actually nabbed them. Super, super excited.
Awesome.
But yeah, I couldn't even tell you where I found them. I spend so much, as a social media manager, I spend so much time on like the internet. I'm like under every internet rock there is available looking for things.
Right. Things are just like floating across your screen. You're just absorbing them all day.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I feel like I should just say this for anybody listening who's like pulling their hair out. Like, what the hell are they talking about? So Far is just like I said, it's a music promotion company, I guess you'd say. They're all over the world. And it's basically like house shows where people like they book these shows not just in houses but in like libraries and public spaces and anywhere that you would not normally see live music, and it's very intimate and usually unplugged and mostly donation based as far as I know, so it's kind of like a way to experience the arts away from like the typical bar loud music venue setting. So super cool. I'm really glad that we got to share in that. Maybe we'll cross paths at one someday.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely signing up for like every ticket they send out.
Yeah, and dude, they're always worth it. It's always someone new. I swear. Like, and sometimes I host ones and it's like someone that's a big artist on Spotify or something. I'm like, what the hell? Like, they bring in really, really cool acts. Anyway, major tangent. Sorry about that. I had to rant. But so from what I've gathered, at least from what I know of you and what you've kind of extrapolated on a little bit, like, you're a writer and you're at this weird intersection that I think a lot of writers are finding themselves nowadays, where you specialize in journalism, but also now you're into social media marketing as well. So how was that initial transition for you from the field of journalism into social media?
It was kind of natural for me, being a like your stereotypical millennial, and being like social media was so important for me, just for my own what became essentially like a personal brand, like how everybody has now. I think I just thought about it in terms of like how I consume news and how to reach a younger audience, and then I spent a lot of time, kind of pitching that to the jobs that I was at. So the first job that I had as a feature writer down in Florida, I had a coworker and I put together a huge presentation about how we could reach a younger audience on social media. They gave us the lead, and it was something that I like added to my resume. And I noticed with every job that I had applied for, or any project that I worked on, that was something that they asked about. In 2015, 16, 17, when social media heyday,
right?
A lot of more companies or projects that I was working on, things like that, they got super excited about the work that I had done, and I moved from being a journalist, like your standard journalist writing features and hard news and whatnot, into being kind of like this social media specialist, and that kind of fumbled me into being more on the social media side than I was on the writing side. So I kind of say my funny way of putting it is I went to social media like kicking and screaming about the importance of like digital and online.
Right. Yeah. Like I talk about social media culture a lot on the show because obviously that's what I do as well. And like one of the things that I like talking about is that I think not a lot of people are thinking or talking about in terms of like how the landscape has shifted, like you said, since the real like explosion where all these people and companies started just to take over the social media presence a few years ago. It's just that like it feels like, so you came from journalism, and I feel like journalism, especially as an industry, like pre-internet and post-internet, looks so different just because everything is like click-based marketing now. Because like now clicks are currency, so we're all online fighting for everybody's attention, fighting for everybody's interests, and it's weird because like in a way that's inherently at odds with what journalism is, which journalism like aims to be, not objective necessarily, but impartial, and it tries to be reporting and all that. Whereas like with social media, it's like there's this inherent element of marketing. So like now those two are kind of integrated in this really strange way. So for you, like you're like the perfect definition. Like I feel like so many people I talk to they come from the exact situation you're in, which is this, like maybe they went to school for creative writing or journalism and now they're working on social media. So like how do you think about this weird integration that we're in right now between those two worlds?
Honestly, it's mind-boggling. Like I feel like every day I sit on my computer, I'm just like, what are we supposed to do today? Because I'm sure something on this hellscape of social media has changed.
It's about to blow up.
Whatever plan I had yesterday, scrap it.
Right.
But it's a really interesting crossroads to be at. And I think that's one of the reasons that I joined journalism, because you never really know what you're going to get yourself into that day. You come to work every day unprepared, and social media is no different. I would say the approach would be, we have a habit in journalism of putting all of our eggs in one basket. When you had the print product, it was very much, throw it all in print. That's what's important. Mm-hmm. When television came along, it was, let's, get on TV. And now that you have digital media and social media, I think we're doing that same thing again, where it's very much like put it all on Facebook. And then I'm sure, I don't know what rock people have been hiding up under to not know what's going on with Facebook right now. But it's for anybody who is a social media manager, my heart goes out to you. It's been tough. You used to be able to post like, I don't know, a picture of your big toe and get like 1,000 clicks. Now, like you would have to get like Cardi B's big toe to get like 6 clicks. It's insane.
Right.
But yeah, it's just, I think it's a matter now. It's like a shift of thinking and moving back to the content is king ideology. I don't care what it is, whatever headline it is that you have, or video that you've attached to it, or money that you put behind, the Facebook post. Content is always going to be what's going to draw your reader back after every fad.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective to throw in here, because I feel like like you hinted at before. I mean, every day the content is constantly shifting. So when you go into your work day, I guess, and in your position or my position, we might have a game plan. Like we might be thinking, like this is our strategy for today's social media or today's articles that we're trying to work on. And then you get hit with this meteor from left field, and now all of a sudden everyone on Twitter, everyone on Facebook is talking about this one topic. So then it kind of forces all the people in our shoes to capitalize on that. And it becomes this really weird thing where like we have to make these constant adjustments where it's not enough anymore to like just be a journalist or just be a social media person. Like you have to integrate, and it sucks because it's like, in my mind at least, kind of like what I was hinting at before, it sucks that traditional journalism in a sense has been dying the past couple decades, and it was dying, I think, in a lot of ways before the internet, but not now. On top of it kind of fading and transitioning into what it is now, we have this whole new trend where like we see the BuzzFeed type companies emerging and Barstool and all these media outlets that are sort of, like you said, they're based on content. They're not necessarily based on like a specific sect of journalism or a specific sect of social media. They kind of have to be jacks of all trades. Like they're trying to capitalize on all the content. So like when you look at the direction of social media, the kind of trajectory that we're on right now and how chaotic it is, do you see it as a net positive, like as we kind of integrate these career paths moving forward, or do you see it as more kind of like through a cynical lens?
Ooh, I'm like cynical in general, so.
Same, so.
I don't know. I feel like it's part of the job of being a journalist. Like you don't graduate without being cynical.
Right.
I don't know. It's a very tricky place because, on the one hand, it's just like you get like the fake news bullshit and it's just very disheartening. But on the other end, you have stories that are brought to light on Twitter of things that you would have never had on your radar had it not been for social media.
Right.
So it's a really tricky place to be at. I would say, like, I want to let my cynicism get to me, but in reality, I would say some form of social media is probably here to stay, and it would be within every publication's best interest to find their content niche. Like, what do you perform best at? Is it making videos? Is it doing live interviews? Is it, the long form stories? Just find that niche that is good for you. And I think that's kind of what you should hone in on, and that'll keep you kind of chugging in the future. Like, BuzzFeed hasn't let go of their lists. Like, those are never going to go away. Their quiz all day.
That's so true. Yeah, BuzzFeed's got like they've capitalized on like a really like a niche market early on before that was used everywhere, and now that's become what they most capitalize on is those goofy ass lists that get made up every day about whatever. Like, what was today? Like, there's like a news story today about one of the Kardashians or the Jenners becoming like a billionaire or something like that, and like everybody's mad about it because she's not really self-made. I don't even know which one it is. I'm sorry, I don't keep up with this stuff, but it's like one of the younger ones I know, and like I imagine like something like that happens in the news, and it's like, oh, this person's a billionaire, everybody's talking about it. So then BuzzFeed immediately is like, okay, how can we take this piece of content and turn it into one of our quirky lists? Like, that's just it's what they do. So I mean, like going into that whole area of like finding niche markets, like we can kind of get into this here. Like, you are now working with Adweek, which is super cool. And like, first off, for my knowledge and for everybody else listening, like, how long have you been with Adweek now?
I have been with them for 6 months.
Cool. So like, since you've been there, like, have you personally fallen into like a niche or like with your writing or skill set?
I've noticed, I've done a little bit of writing. I've actually had the opportunity to do a couple of stories for a magazine. But I've noticed that my niche is probably snarky Twitter. And like, I'm almost like a to say it. Like, all my picks up hostility just like comes through on our Twitter. But it's been really good as far as like engagement. But one of the things that we've actually honed in on that's great for engagement is our Adweek chats that happen every Wednesday at 2, where it's just like pick a topic to focus on, and we'll invite the entire internet to have a conversation with us, and it's more than just plugging stories. It's very much like a fireside chat,
right?
Where we'll pick a topic and everybody is welcome. Everyone can have their opinion. There's like networking happening in the comment section. So I would say that's probably been one of the highlight things that I've noticed about working there. But yeah, I would definitely say like our Twitter is popping.
It definitely has, but I've gotten Oh, sorry. What was that?
I'm bragging on myself.
You're right to brag. It's okay. It's a great account. I noticed. I noticed recently, even like I don't know if it was you running it, but you did one of these chat questionnaire type things, and the account I managed, Stakem, was getting tagged in a bunch of it, which I thought was super funny. I was like, I wonder if this is her behind the screen right now, like managing the.
It wasn't the last 6 months. It was me.
That's so cool. So like, okay, so you've been messing around with the Twitter account. Like, has this been something that Adweek essentially, like, you met with them and they're like, okay, here's the ball, let's run with it? Or has there been like an internal kind of progression of what they want their social media voice to be?
I think they had a social media voice, and I just kind of helped hone in on it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I had noticed the social media editors before me, the one who set up the Adweek chat, has a incredible voice on Twitter. And what I did was kind of learn from that, hone in on it, and then use my own, I don't know, like my own like sense of being, my own sense of social media and how I understood like memes and GIFs and like that to work, like internet culture, I guess is the word that I should be using.
Yeah,
I use my own knowledge of internet culture. Exactly, to like thread into it. And I feel like that's been really, really helpful for sure.
When you look at just the general landscape of all sorts of brands right now on social media, like whether it's, media company brands or food brands or what have you, how much of that element of what you just said there, like your personality and your knowledge of internet culture, how important do you think it is for brands to have someone or a team of people behind them that is like well versed in that area?
Jesus Christ, if you do nothing else, have authenticity, be genuine. I think one of the things that, as a social media manager, that upsets me the most is when I know you know like this Steve Buscemi. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. Meme where he comes up with the skateboard over his. I feel like there's so many brands that emulate that. Like we've moved away from like the using words like fleek and bay and lit, and now it's just like using like existential crisis and anxiety as a way to like reach your audience, which comes off to me as like, I don't know. It's almost like repackaging internet culture and like selling it back to you, which is weird. But there are some accounts that are good at it. Like obviously, since you guys are like OGs. But then you have accounts like Moon Pie or Wendy's, who has just been, I don't even know who their social media manager is, but hats off to them.
Right, yeah.
And a handful of other accounts that have been like just really good at it. Like, do you remember the Denny's one that blew up where you had to like zoom in on the butter? That's exactly like once I feel like that is like the really good way to like tiptoe between being, you know, having one foot steeped in the culture and another foot being like, we do recognize that we are like a brand though, you know, without being like weird and awkward and very like, hey, fellow kids, about it.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something I try to talk about this all the time on the podcast just because I think it's really, it's both interesting and it's disturbing for people who follow this type of thing, because I think you worded it perfectly there, where in a way it is like we're basically like repackaging a lot of nostalgia and angst and reselling it to people, and there's a weird ethical tension in there, because I can remember back, like you said, like 2013, 14, 15, where it was really trendy for brands, especially on Twitter, to use quote-unquote millennial lingo, like on fleek, and even just like I can't even say it without the quote-unquote because it's such a dumb term, but like on fleek and bay and all that. And it's weird because at the time, when you look at how the culture itself responded to brands doing that, a lot of the people were, you had obviously like a strong vocal sect of people who just criticize brands and criticize capitalism and corporatism and all that in general, which is kind of like it's a growing sect of voices, but it's a minority as a whole, I think. But the majority of critics were people being like, you're lame. Like, these brands sound lame. They sound like they're run by old people. They sound like they're run by people that are out of touch with the culture. So, like, that was the main complaint for years on social media, is that, like you said, the Steve Buscemi "Hello, fellow kids" thing. And it's weird because it's like all the brands and like the marketing experts, they took that to heart, and they're like, okay, like, let's go back to the drawing board. What can we do? Oh, I know. We'll put some hip, relatable millennial or whatever at the helm of our account, and they'll start posting relatable content. And now that that's become like the norm, I guess you'd say, for most of these accounts, you have all this weird shit happening, like you hinted at, like this millennial angst, and you see these depression tweets and all this like more deeply intimate content that you really, I think at a deep fundamental level, like we don't want that from our brands, but at the same time, it's like it's like the thing that we relate to. So it's what we want in good advertising, but in terms of advertising as a whole, it's inherently manipulative. So it puts us in this like really sticky situation where it's like, well, people like you or I, if we're doing our jobs well, that's like the vein that we're going to approach. But like you said, there's like this weird line we have to walk between being relatable and posting cool content, and then also not being over the top and like just like emotionally manipulative. Like the whole Sunny D tweet was like clearly it was like a line that I think culture drew in the sand, where it's like, okay, this is where we need to stop. Like, this is where we need to not take things a step further in this direction, because now we've reached a point of commodifying mental illness or what have you. Like, that's how it was perceived, at least in the media. So like, what are some of your thoughts on like that ethical tension?
I think it's a really tough spot to be in, because like we said, like, you want to churn out, because we're content machines, especially in this digital age where like it's not even like a 24-hour news cycle anymore. Like, it's insane how much you have to put out to to get those clicks. But I don't know. It's just like, you want to walk the line. You want to be relatable, but you also want the clicks. But I feel like personally, especially coming from a journalistic background, ethics is going to win every time. There are some stuff that I feel like, like it's Twitter and it's going to get a portion, but there are other things where, like, if you don't understand the cultural context that this is coming from, like there was I think it was an aquarium, don't quote me on that, but it was a brand that had used the word thick a while back, and they actually caught some flack for it because they didn't understand the cultural context.
Yes.
So I feel like it all leads back to, like, being genuine, being authentic. And I feel like, that ties into a larger conversation about, like, diverse newsrooms, diverse staffing, and things like that. Just to have some different ideas to be able to bounce off of and pick from. Because had it been somebody who is a little bit more familiar with the terminology, familiar with internet culture in the room, I would say it might have been a different situation. It might have been more positively received.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the, if I'm remembering right, I think it was the Monterey Bay aquarium situation. Yeah,
I think
that's such a good point to jump off here, because I really want to get into this and get a lot of your perspectives regarding diversity in the workplace and how to approach sensitive topics like that on social media. So, like, I listened to a bit of your recent Adweek podcast that you did with yeah, that's probably an ad, where, like, you were talking about race and advertising. Yeah, super cool. It's really insightful for someone like me, especially, who's on the outside of this discussion as a whole. So, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that in general, and, like, we can kind of, let's start broad and then we can narrow it down from there. So, like, first off, like, what are your thoughts currently on minority representation in industries like advertising and journalism right now?
I feel like the fact that we're talking about it says that there's not enough.
Good quote.
I feel like when we no longer have to meet a quota of brown faces in the room, then at that point, then we've made it. I would say that this is my first time stepping over into advertising. So luckily I had our other podcasters who are able to speak more on that. But as far as journalism and media, you have people who are in the room, but like I said on that podcast, you need to give them a seat at the table as well, and give them equity and amplify their voices. And I feel like that's going to be where you're going to break that mold of having the ideas that are like the Gucci and the Prada, where you're facing backlash from entire, like, major communities of people.
Right.
If you had just had them in the room and allowed them to speak and say, hey, that's not the move. Let's try something else, back to the drawing board. And, I feel like equality is one thing, but equity and a seat at the table and amplifying those voices is another. And I feel like the further that we get along with that and having a mixed room of people who are speaking and giving their opinions and thoughts on things and creative ideas, I feel like that's where we reach that breaking point where it's just like, we don't have to have discussions anymore about how many brown people, how many LGBTQ people, how many, disabled people that we have in the room, because now it's a norm.
Right. Yeah, that's such an interesting point to make. So, like, how do you deal with this idea that, like, when companies today are talking about diversity, it's almost exclusively happening in these, like, boardroom settings where so much of it is based off of almost, like you said, a quota, where they're looking to make themselves look and feel better in a lot of cases, and, like, not necessarily based on seeking out diverse candidates based on experience and qualifications.
Right. A lot of times you'll hear, well, we don't know where to look for those different voices. But I feel like the fact that the internet exists kind of eliminates anybody's, like, I don't know where to look.
Right.
There's national associations of these minority voices and these marginalized groups that you could easily connect with. You can look on college campuses, and things like that, that can provide these voices for you to allow that, to break the stereotypical pipeline that we have of talent that, is not necessarily seen past just your regular schmegular jobs, and getting them into places of management where they can really be heard and their voices can be amplified and them given more standing ground.
Yeah, like, for you personally, like, when you look at this issue as a whole, like, if you had, let's just theorize for a second. Like, if you had unlimited resources, how would you first go about working on this issue from, like, a top-down level?
Oh God.
I know this is obviously not a gotcha or anything moment. I'm really interested to know, just from like a theoretical standpoint, like what are some ideas from someone in your shoes? Like what do you think are some things that could potentially be like tangible solutions for people that are really stuck in this like institutional framework where it seems like not a lot is getting done?
I think the first step would probably be, if I had unlimited resources, obviously I would create a team looking outside of the place we typically look. Instead of hiring your golf buddy's daughter to on this project that you've known for 15 years, like maybe take a look at the person that has been prominent on your Twitter timeline for a little while and see what they're talking about and what they have to offer. Hanging out at your college is one thing, but what about your sister in college, or what about an HBCU? I think it's more of strategizing to kind of get from beyond your comfort zone. If it were me and I was able to do that, I would love to put together a team that's able to kind of like look underneath all the surfaces and be like, okay, there's a group that works out of here, or there's, a small organization that works out at this location, or there's a group who meets for brunch every week to talk about, advertising, like whatever the case may be. I think it just would take a little bit more digging to find those people that are not within your immediate peripheral.
Right, yeah, because I mean, we all love what's comfortable, right? It's like it's like, oh,
right,
I know this person, or I grew up with this person, I know them, like they're familiar to me. Like, it's like when you look at that from the outside, like is that why you think it's so difficult for so many companies to do this? Is it like just a discomfort with diversity and the challenges, I guess, that come along with that?
Even with my inherent cynicism, I don't believe that people are inherently bad. So I definitely do think that it's kind of like a blind spot, you know? You don't typically think outside of what you're comfortable with or what you already know. It takes a lot for you to step outside of that. So I feel like even sometimes when we think that we're diverse and we think that we have a diverse background and, I have Black friends, I would say that it does take a little bit more effort to step outside of what you're familiar with to kind of expose yourself to different things, Yeah.
So
absolutely. I would say that would be the first step in discovering some of these other places. And I would imagine that some of the people that are in leadership positions would be surprised and amazed to find out, what organizations and what people exist outside of your immediate, view.
Okay, so obviously this issue is super complex and it's super involved, and it's not just like a one-off answer to solve everything. But like, in your view, how much of this do you think is institutional versus like how much of it do you think is personal prejudice on that, or not just prejudice, I should say, like we said, there's a lot of just people who are uncomfortable with change, but obviously like they kind of go hand in hand, if you want to word it that way. So how much, like, when you look at the problem as a whole, like how much of it do you think is institutional versus personal?
I would say a large part of it is institutional. You don't want to break the code, Mm-hmm. You don't want to be the one to raise your voice, because there's two sides of it. You can raise your voice if you have that power, if you have that standing, but not everybody feels empowered to say, we need to diversify our team. We need to make changes. And then on the other side of that, maybe you do feel empowered to say something like that, and then you're facing backlash and being reprimanded now for speaking up against the status quo, So I feel like that's a very tricky space to be in my opinion. I would say, like I said, more institutionalized, just because like this is how we've always done it. This is how we do things. But personally, I believe that just because it's how we've always done something doesn't necessarily make it right.
Right. Yeah, and you hinted at this before, just by kind of bringing up the whole mindset, which is that common phraseology we hear a lot in these conversations, where certain people will make statements like, "Oh, I have Black friends," or "I hired a Black worker," or something like that. And I think that kind of ties into this whole idea, this whole mindset, where we're in like an equal society. Like there is equality, but you hinted it before, like the kind of equality versus equity when looking at this from like a larger contextual framework. So like if you could just kind of get into this a little bit for people listening, like how do you separate those two by definition, and like what does it mean to have equality versus equity in the workplace?
Equality would be hiring somebody, let's say that they have great qualifications, they're diverse, they come from a different background. Sure. hire them, give them the job that you give them, and you're good to go. But I feel like giving them equity, giving them a seat at the table is you providing a little bit more. Let's say that you're in the boys club and you're able to give your ideas and your suggestions. Why not slide that door open a little bit further, just so the person that you know is capable of doing the work and capable of bringing these new ideas, offer them an opportunity to be able to kind of say what they need to say, and like I've said, amplify their voices. Kind of co-sign what they said. I think, me personally, in most of the jobs that I've had, I've worked under a woman, which is I didn't know how much of luck I was in, having that happen to me, but all of them co-signed the things that I was saying. And I think that's kind of the savings that got me to where I am now, just by them being like, she has an idea, let's hear her out. Let's she has to say. And I feel like if there was more of that happening, which is kind of like, again, that seat at the table, that equity, I feel like there'd be a lot less mishaps and having to apologize on the back end for not including those voices in, whatever work you put out.
Right. So it's kind of like the difference between just like you hiring someone of diversity and having them be there doing the work, and then having them actually in a position where they have clout and influence and, like you said, a place at the table. When we look at this whole thing, because obviously we're kind of like drifting, not in like total cynicism, but we're kind of like looking at this through a little bit of a critical lens from an institutional perspective. So like, despite the flaws that we're talking about here, like, do you view the direction that we're moving in as a net positive insofar as like how corporate culture is integrating more Black voices and more minority voices? Hit me with that cynicism.
I would say that we're still at the point where we haven't quite gotten it. Again, until we are not having to have these conversations anymore, I feel like that would be the point that it's like, we've got it. When it's no longer something that you have to, when we no longer have to like pause and think about the diversity that's in our newsrooms and that's across our boards and in our staffs, I feel like that's when we've accomplished our goal. At that point, you're hiring people not based off of, okay, do I have enough of these people in here? Do I have enough of these people in here? And it's more so of like, okay, I provided a space for different creative minds. Let's see what we can put out. Let's see what we can do.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people who might be cynical toward what we're saying, like what you just said right there, like maybe there's someone listening who's coming at it from a cynical perspective on the other end, who's thinking, well, like we have equal opportunity, like we have situations where minority voices and minority people are getting hired in these situations. So like, what in your mind, like as we're kind of like moving slowly and steadily forward, quote unquote, but it doesn't seem like we're getting there fast enough or we're doing enough, like you said, because we're not, like we're still having to have these conversations. We're still having to sort out potential solutions to get these voices at the table. So like from your perspective, is there any tangible way you can think of that would expedite the process a little bit or like move us in a more productive direction?
Right now, I think a lot of corporate culture is like this pyramid, this hierarchy of how working works. And this is something else that we've brought up on the podcast. Our host, David Greiner, actually brought up this point, and I'll reiterate it. That was really, really good. We have this hierarchy of, well, we have one position at the top. And then from there, there's like the median level people, and then you have like your worker bees at the very bottom. But I feel like if we open that up and it no longer is just like one creative mind at the top working the position of like, head honcho. Mm-hmm. I feel like at that point you open yourself up to more diverse and different ideas. Now that you don't have this top-down leadership where what I say goes. Mm. And I feel like opening that door for other voices at the top, I think would definitely help.
So a lot of it's like there's gatekeepers at the top that are keeping this from happening.
Absolutely.
I think this kind of goes back to a lot of discussions that are happening right now just in the political and the social sphere, where we have back and forth between, I guess you could just say like capitalism or neoliberalism and socialism or more social democratic policies, where there's definitely a rising need, especially in young people, I would say, where there's people having these conversations that are looking at the corporate structures specifically in the United States, and they're saying, obviously, we have like the people pointing out the top 1% and all that, which has been going on for years. But I think even at this institutional level within corporate structures, we have people that are looking at the top bosses, the top people in charge, the gatekeepers, and we're seeing like for every 100 workers in some cases, there's one person at the top, and they're arms and shoulders above everybody else, and they're kind of like keeping those 100 people not down in a literal sense, but in an institutional sense, where it's like there's this feeling like the workers don't have power, like we don't have like a full say, like a full seat at the table. It's interesting that you bring it up in that context. Like you said, was it David Griner that said that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's interesting how he brought it up in that context. I feel like that is the context that so many of these political conversations are happening right now, and I agree. I think there's something to be said about just like the systemic structures that we're so used to working in, and like this is just the way it's been for so long on these corporate levels. And it's like I think especially as time goes on and as quote unquote like hustle culture keeps going, and like we keep working like longer hours, longer days, like we're trying to get more content in. It's like it feels like we're driving this whole thing off a cliff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Because I mean, like I don't know, like I'd love to get some of your perspective on this. Because like for me, I'm the type of person who, and you mentioned this earlier, like you're a busybody. You like to be doing a lot of things all the time, and I'm similar in the sense that like I like working. Like I enjoy, like I don't really turn off, honestly. Like I do take breaks and I try to meditate and all that nonsense when I feel like I'm on the brink of a mental breakdown, but I try to work as much as I can because I feel like I could always be doing more. And I think that mindset for me to a certain extent works, but I know it's not a long-term stability plan. Like I know that if I do that consistently, I'm going to drive myself into a ditch. And I feel like that mindset is like this toxic, not just in the workplace, but just culturally. Like I feel like we're in this hustle mentality culturally where everybody, doesn't matter if you're working at the lowest levels or the highest levels, everyone it's like it's in the air almost. Like people feel like they have to be working all the time. And because of that inequality, like whether it's income inequality or whether it's diversity inequality, like we have this situation where people, like the 99% or the minority voices, are working really hard, but they're not able to get a leg up in a lot of these situations. Like they're not getting that seat at the table. So like I'd be interested to know like what your thoughts are on this whole idea of like hustle culture right now.
I cannot wait for Rise and Grind and hustle culture to die a fiery death. I think it is the worst thing. I hate it so much. I was actually reading an article on Man Repeller earlier. I think the byline was Molly Conway.
Okay.
Where she talked about like having like what used to be a hobby, like something that you like liked doing, and like feeling this need to like monetize it. She brought up a really, really good point, or they brought up a really good point, actually, of a friend that had on like a gorgeous dress. And they asked the friend, do you sell? Is there like an Etsy shop or something? And like the disappointed look that the friend had on the face was just like, no, girl, like I just like doing this. And I feel like that should be like I feel like I have so many friends who love writing, but they get so burnt out having to like pitch and distribute their stories all over the place to like justify their love of writing because they're getting paid for it. When in actuality, like if you like writing or if you like designing or if you like photography, it should just be something that you like doing. Your value is not attached, your value as a person, in my belief, is not attached to how much money you're raking in.
Well,
and I feel like go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead. Sorry. It was a little bit of a delay.
The hustle culture, and I feel like the people who perpetuate it, especially on social media, it's such an unfair game that they're playing because they'll say, oh, I'm a blogger and, I don't sleep, but you don't know like what job that they're doing on the side or like what money that they come from or their background, anything like that. So you're looking at these people being like, I need to do what they're doing, when in actuality, like, when people say that, oh, you have the same 24-hour days that Beyonce has. Bullshit. Beyonce has an entire team of people.
Right.
You're just you. You are you by yourself.
Oh my God, that's literally the perfect example. Like you said, I mean, it's so frustrating when you only get this little window into somebody's brand online where it's like, oh, hustle all the time. I'm selling essential oils or whatever it is. And like, meanwhile, they're not even like, they don't even have to work. Like they maybe just like have money that they inherited, or maybe like their spouse works and they get to just stay home and do this all the time. And then it becomes this perception where we're forcing it into the culture. And it's like, oh, this person is saying work all the time, be posting online all the time. But meanwhile, like that's probably not even where they're getting their income, because it doesn't even make logical sense sometimes. It's like where is this person? Like I'm looking at their Twitter feed or their website or whatever. It's like, where is the income flowing here? I don't see like a merch store. I don't see hundreds of thousands of followers. Like I don't see paid posts. Like how is this hustle culture even like a genuine thing in so many cases?
It's so ridiculous. Like, if you have the opportunity to sleep on the weekend, please do it. If you want to go to brunch with your friends, please do it. Do not feel obligated to continue with this trash-ass hustle culture. To get a leg up on what? Like, for what?
Well, okay, this is a good spot to be in then. So, like, for you then, when you look at all this, the other side of that coin is that people who follow hustle culture, they say, well, maybe not everyone has to hustle, but hustling helps you succeed. Hustling helps open up potential doors. So, like, from your perspective, how much of that is tethered to just, like, how shitty the economy is right now?
I feel like, you're out here with the tough questions. I would say, like, hustle culture probably stemmed from our economy. I feel like a lot of it has to do with, like, okay, well, in order for me to pay my rent, because I'm not getting paid more, rent prices and things like how much things cost has gone up.
Right.
Wages, not so much. So, obviously at one point it was viable to have a job and like a side hustle to be able to maybe have an apartment by yourself that you don't have to share with roommates, of course, or to be able to afford the traveling that you like to do. Yeah, that makes sense to me. But when it becomes this like epidemic shaming that's happening online because like, oh God, like you spent your weekends in bed, like, yeah, like Monday through Friday was hard, girl. Like, I spent my weekend in bed.
Please give me this one day.
Exactly. But yeah, no, I feel like a lot of it is like stemmed to our culture. And like now it's just become like this huge monstrosity of if you're not working hard all day, every day, like, like what is your worth?
Do you see the tide turning in a way? Like, I feel maybe it's just my little echo chamber of who I follow, but I feel that a lot of the people, at least in the circles I follow, have been posting more critical hot takes on hustle culture. And it feels like there's like it feels like a bubble bursting almost. You know what I mean? Like, do you think that is happening, or do you think that we're kind of just like still going strong with it?
I think you have the self-care advocates kind of coming for that hustle culture. And I feel like that's a battle. Again, like with all things, you have to find like a balance. Like I'm all for hustle, I think it's a good idea to be out there networking and talking to people and putting your work out there. But I feel like that is not necessarily tied to a monetary worth,
Right.
Sometimes it's that you're going to, not that you're getting your piece published and paid for. Maybe it's that you're going to a reading, if we're talking about specifically about writers. Maybe it's that you are going to, a fireside chat, or you're hosting a panel or something like that, which may not necessarily be getting paid for, but it's still part of you hustling to like promote yourself and what you're good at. But yeah, I feel like there's an advocacy for self-care, because I think now we're starting to see the burnout of that hustle culture, to where I just read a piece a little while ago, and I can't quote the headline or the writer for this one. Apologies. But it was a big one. I think it was on BuzzFeed actually a while ago, about how like millennials are often trapped in this inability to do regular shit because you are so burnt out from like the bigger things. You don't even know how to approach the everyday regular stuff. Like going to the post office is now like this big to do because you've strategized all these other huge initiatives. And now it's just like, I don't even know where to start with the small stuff.
Oh my God.
Or do I even want to get to
Yeah. Dude, I remember reading that article. I forget who wrote it too, which I feel bad about because it was an amazing article. And that really, really hit the nail on the head with so much of this. I feel like, too, it's weird because hustle, like when I think of hustling, I try to explain it to people. Like I talked to my wife about this recently, actually. It reminds me of just how I used to go about my art as a whole. Like I would think, as far as songwriting is concerned, like there's this attitude amongst a lot of young artists and songwriters where they think, oh, like if only I could make it to the point where I didn't have to do my day job and I could just songwrite all day or just work on my beats all day. And like, from my perspective, at least, it's different for everybody, I guess, but this is where I come from. It's like part of the hustle and like part of what gets you from point A to B in whatever you're doing, whether it's your career, your passion, whatever, is actually just living life. Like taking a nap is part of hustle culture, if we want to talk about it like that. Like watching Netflix, eating lunch, like having sex, like whatever it is. Like these are things because we can't create art, like we can't create good work without good life experiences. So like if you're a writer and you're trying to write about shit, you can't write without your own personal life experiences. Like you have to bring that personality, that experience to the table in what you're doing because that's what creates good work. So it's this like weird thing where like almost the hustle culture we see, it's almost like depleting the humanity, which is what actually makes hustle culture work. Like for me, and again, I don't know, everybody's different. I guess some people, maybe they work better when they just have all the time in the world. Like if someone was rich, I guess, and you didn't have to do a day job and you could just sit at home all day and noodle on your instrument, I guess for some people that's cool. But like for me, I like the whole idea of like I go to work and I come home and I take a nap or I watch TV or I read a book, whatever it might be. And then, like, that experience is what translates back into my work or back into my hobbies. So it's like we have this natural cycle where we spend time with friends, we read, we go through life. And I think what hustle culture, as it stands today, does is it kind of depletes all of that cycle and makes it all about work. Like, you just have to be working all the time, even though I think when it boils down to it, work itself should be at least like life experience. Like just when you think, I don't know what the corporate structure is like at Adweek. I'd be interested to know if you could kind of like spill some tea on it. But thinking how like a lot of new businesses today, they've restructured their like internal space where it's like they encourage more open conversations. They encourage like some places install gyms at their place, like some places install like lobby, like hangout rooms, or they put games in their room, whatever. And I think there's like two sides to that. Obviously, like there's the one side where it's like corporations are trying to like keep you there and make you live there, but there's also like the side of there's also the side of it that's like, this is cool because you can't be working a 9-hour day or a 10-hour day all day. Like you have to take a break. You have to joke with your friends. You have to like look at some memes. Like you have to kind of live in order to hustle. So like, I don't know. That's where I come from with it. Like I think it can be good, but like you said, it's just, I feel like the whole thing's become so toxic at this point.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, like back in middle school when we learned about like our bodies, like they told you scientifically, you literally cannot survive without sleep. You cannot survive without a break. Like you literally fall into pieces, like ligaments just like falling off all over the place. You can't keep it together. So I would definitely say like, I feel like a lot of creativity stems from like you stepping back and taking a break. You hear people going on like these sabbaticals to be able to like regroup. Even for me as a social media manager, when I have downtime, I find a lot of what I'm doing is like scrolling through Instagram, scrolling through Twitter and through Facebook and through Tumblr, and all the other ones. And like, while it can be a hellscape, there are some gems in there that like, while I'm not doing anything, just like mindlessly looking, that I get ideas. And I'm like, we should try that for Adweek. That's something that I should definitely incorporate. that is one thing that I do absolutely love about my job, is that there's very much like there's space for like me to be innovative.
Yeah.
There's space for me to try things. I'll come with ideas and say, hey, you know, like let's try this. And it's very much like, okay, yeah, let's, you know, what's the plan? How should we conquer this? How should we do this? And I feel like, especially with social media, since it's like a changing landscape, that there's a lot of space to play there. So I would definitely say, like, across newsrooms, that's kind of the approach, especially the social.
So, like, that's really interesting, and I think that I feel very lucky and similar in the sense that for my job as a social media manager, yeah, like a lot of it, like you said, it's not just sitting at a computer all day and being forced to write content and to research content. Like, a lot of it comes from just like you chilling out, doing some scrolling, like going through some of your favorite websites, and then you get inspired, then you see something that really clicks or resonates in a way that then you can put into your work. And I think it's really cool that Adweek gives you that freedom, and I think it's cool that a lot of companies are starting to do this a little bit more. I mean, obviously it's incremental, and most of it's just to further their own bottom lines, I guess. But it's at least making the environment itself a little bit more healthy for people like us, so that we don't so naturally drive off a cliff into that burnout phase. You know, 'cause it's just so easy. Because, like, you know, like you said, and like I kind of scoffed when you first were talking about scrolling there, because I feel that both ways. Like, I feel it, like you said, in a positive way, where, yeah, sometimes you get inspired, but sometimes I catch myself on my breaks or when I'm just like at home at night and I'm doing that same thing, and I'm like, what am I doing? Like, this is what I'm doing at work. Like, why am I doing this in my free time? So yeah, there's definitely a give and a take there. But I mean, like, I'm kind of interested to hear your take as far as how. Just let's step here into the political spectrum temporarily. Like, I'm not going to peg you with anything polarizing, but just on the topic of polarization and how everything has become so politicized the past few years on social media, and how just like with our jobs and just corporate culture in general, like we've been talking about, like social media has kind of been like the centering point where so many of these big changes are happening, all these conversations are happening, and it just feels like the past few years have been a tornado for literally everybody. So, like, I'm interested to know for you personally, especially because this is your job, like how has the political polarization of the past few years affected you and your outlook toward work? Just because, like, your personal identity is wrapped up so closely with all this.
I have the personal belief that everybody who's ugly online is actually a bot and they're not a real person.
It's a good. That's a good mindset to keep.
I just tell myself, oh, they're not real. For you to be this mean, there's no way you're real.
People can't be this mean in real life.
There's no way. But I think for my personal social media, I think I've done a really good job at kind of creating this safe space. So like when I log out of my personal media and go to like the one for, you know, for my jobs account, and I see all these different accounts that we're following, or just like the trending things that are on Twitter, I'm just like, oh God, is this the hellscape that other people are experiencing?
Oh yeah.
Like,
yep.
Because my personal Twitter, and I suggest doing this, give everything the Marie Kondo treatment. Absolutely. Does it spark joy? If not, get rid of that shit. I do that for accounts for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you know, whatever it is. I would say that to kind of keep yourself sane as a social media manager, going into battle every day on your company site, is to make sure that your social media, if you have it, is a safe space for you and kind of coincides with the ideologies that you have. And I feel like that's probably your best bet. I have a lot of diverse voices on my timeline, people who create art, people who do words, people who come from corporate backgrounds, but they all kind of have the general sense of like humans can do good. And I think I appreciate that. And it definitely helps me keep this sane mindset, which I think definitely feeds into why I feel like, oh my God, that person's so mean. This must be a bot. Because all people are nice.
Right.
All people have but yeah, I would definitely just make sure that like your social media personally is kind of like what's in line with what brings you joy. And I think that will kind of help you be able to conquer looking at your company's social media, where there's just like all types of stuff that you have not curated yourself, for sure.
Right. I feel like with Twitter specifically, I mean, just looking, because I think with Instagram, it's really easy to do what you just said, because in Instagram, you can just follow like artists or, people who are posting motivational stuff, and it filters through your feed in a way that's really easy to scroll through, and you don't have to get lost in the muck of what, like crazy political thing just happened in the news like that second. But like with Twitter, which is where most of us live, at least on like an hourly basis with work. Maybe people that work on social media aren't on it like all day, but they're on it, checking it, throughout the day. And I feel like just as a platform, it's inherently outrage centered. I mean, it's just like, because it is so here and now, like it's right now, there's outrage happening, like a news story breaks, and you're getting everybody's visceral reaction to that in the moment. Like there's no time to think. There's no time to contemplate how we're gonna like word something. It's like, oh, Trump just tweeted this, so now right away, if you want that kind of like click currency, like if you want that attention on your tweet, you have to, as quick as possible, you have to word something snarky or witty and put it out there, and then it kind of gets swept up into this cycle. And I think, to your point, like I agree. Like I wish that I could make my personal Twitter feed more, I guess, positive, but it's so hard because I don't know. Like for me personally, this is just me. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Like I feel somewhat of a I'm a nerd when it comes to politics and talking about social issues and all this, which I love talking to you. I love hearing your perspectives on all this, especially the stuff around like diversity and race, which is just not obviously my wheelhouse. So like when it comes to these topics, I try to absorb as much from the outside as I can. And inevitably, in doing that, you're getting caught in like a hailstorm, like you're getting hit with trolls and you're getting hit with negativity and hot takes, and people are really just fired up on social media. So it's hard for someone like me, because I like to stay informed, and that does, like you said, like the Marie Kondo thing, that does spark joy. Like I like to be informed. I like to know what's happening, but at the same time, it's so difficult with Twitter specifically, because there's like a point of diminishing return where the cycle never ends. It's like some people just live on Twitter and they're live tweeting the negative political shit happening every single hour of every single day, and it's easy to get caught up in that cycle of seeing the stuff in your news feed. And it's like, for someone like me, I use the scapegoat sometimes of being like, well, I need to be informed. Like I need to be paying attention to shit, when in reality, I think a lot of times I'm falling into the cycle you're talking about, where it's like it's at one point just feeding into this negativity, and I'm not really getting anything positive from it. So like from your perspective, like, do you think there is something to that, like to keeping yourself informed, and like how do you define that line personally?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to backtrack. So my timeline is not all like puppies and rainbows. There are a lot of puppies on there, but it's not puppies and rainbows. Being that I'm a journalist and I follow other journalists, obviously I'm being exposed to a lot of news. But I think you have to come at it. It's a really tricky place to be, because like you want to be informed. But I think the key is following sources that are going to do a good job of informing you. I think when you start to see sources, like the Twitter accounts that just really grind my gears are the ones that quote shit with no source. They're just throwing numbers out, skewed statistics, and just whatever, and people take it as information,
right,
without backing it up, without verifying it. And I feel like there, like, I honestly don't know how to combat that. I feel like there are so many fact checkers and Snopes and PolitiFact and things like that exist. But there's only so much work that they can do. Like when you think about the scape of how big social media is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say a lot of it is just like a matter of, following voices that, are one, actual accounts, and two, do a good job of when they break news that there is a conversation that surrounds it where they're either willing to hear an alternate point of view, or they're willing to admit, here's what we have right now. We're waiting on facts, or I don't have the answer. I feel like that's absolutely okay to say that you don't right now. I don't have the answer.
Yeah, no one's saying that on Twitter.
So I feel, oh no, absolutely not. Like I don't ever throw out a hot take. Like I don't throw out hot takes unless I've done like my research, because like as a journalist, I know that I could say anything and somebody will take that as fact. Somebody will say, oh, well, I saw it on Twitter and she works for a news organization, so she must know what she was talking about. She must be a valid source.
Yeah.
So I would definitely kind of tidying that up just to make sure that the people that you're following, kind of understand what news value is, the conversation that surrounds that.
Right. Yeah, I want to go back to something we had said earlier in the conversation where you had mentioned how cool it is that, in a way, social media has given voice to a lot of people, like especially within minority voices, and it's propped up minority voices in a way that just has never existed. It's unprecedented in history, which is really cool. And along with that, it's like thinking back to like the rise of Black Lives Matter around like 2013, 14, and how so much of that conversation around race specifically was through social media. So I mean, like looking at the landscape now, like the landscape today as far as the outrage cycle and political polarization and just how crazy everything is, and then thinking back to a few years ago when these like topics of social justice were on the rise and a lot of these conversations were just getting started. Like, do you think as a whole that our conversations on social media have been beneficial around race specifically?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think having a platform that allows us to have those conversations is beneficial. Like, obviously, you take an L because there are accounts that their entire mission is to discredit and, to kind of raise hell in the comment section.
Right.
But I do feel like by being able to reach across and engage and see different viewpoints, that it's beneficial. So I would definitely say, like there's work to be done. Obviously, all of it can't be done on social media, but I am grateful for the things that have been brought to light and, the conversations that have been able to be had on social media regarding diversity and, a spectrum of other topics that wouldn't normally be had. It's you don't want to run up on your diverse neighbor and be like, what do you think of this? But it is easier to comment back to somebody on Twitter and have them explain why they're saying what they're saying, or vice versa.
Right. It's like a lot of these conversations are happening for the first time on social media because it's kind of given us a space to, and not like a safe space necessarily, but it's given us a platform and an opportunity to present some of these weird gray areas and differences that people in general, I think, have never really felt comfortable addressing. Like I remember just personally how I grew up. I mean, I grew up in a suburb outside of Philly. And, we had, black kids at our school, but it's vastly majority white kids. And just like thinking growing up about my friends who were black and the conversations that we had, like there was never an emphasis on race. At least that I can think of. Like it might have gotten brought up in like history classes or whatever, but the conversations that we actually had on a cultural, social level, it just didn't really. It wasn't emphasized. Like if I remember, for me personally, there was a lot of like the whole, don't see color, like don't, like just we're all people, right? Like there's nothing to see here. And I remember like when Black Lives Matter first hit the mainstream, and that was really, for me personally, that was the first time ever that I really had to step back and be like, I've never really taken the time to think through this at all. Like I've had black friends growing up that I just never had these conversations with, which is so mind-blowing. I can't imagine, like, look, especially like when you get into like the more rural areas of the country, it's like I can't imagine what that's been like the past at least the past couple decades, because it feels like between, like, I don't know exactly, but it almost feels like somewhere between the civil rights era and now there's been this weird dormancy where, like, I don't know if it's just in the air, like, but politically people have just kind of like assumed, oh, like racism is over, like we had a black president, like everything is cool now. And like all of a sudden with the rise of Black Lives Matter and how it was integrated into these social media conversations, we had people talking like across different backgrounds. And like you said, obviously, like there's the element of, you know, people being volatile, and it hasn't all been good. Like there's been polarization added in a lot of ways from, you know, like just the cultural divide in general right now. But I think it's been really cool for me just to observe, because like, yeah, I didn't really think about this, you know, the past when I was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say like social media, it becomes like a confrontational place where like you know, like there are some times where things are brought into your timeline where you don't have a choice but to think about it, because now you've been presented with this information, you know, you have no choice but to think about it. I actually read When They Call You a Terrorist, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors. I highly recommend that book to understand the beginnings of that movement. But yeah, no, you're right. Like there was kind of this tone, I think, throughout America. But I feel like as a brown person, it was not necessarily the same understanding. I think social media just kind of brought to light the things that brown people had already been saying.
Right.
And I think it just, which I feel like, which goes back to the importance of social media, is those voices became amplified. Now it's no longer that, you know, the 6 people in your neighborhood know about your, you know, about the things that have been happening or the injustices that you've been facing. But now you have a megaphone through social media to be able to bring some of these things to light.
Yeah, that's been like the big thing where like people of color have been saying the past several years, like we've been saying this stuff for decades, but no one's listened. And now that we are on social media, it's like you said, it's forced in front of all of our faces, and we either choose to address it and to talk about it, or get defensive and ignore it, or, you know, make it like a tribal thing and choose sides, which is really unhelpful. Yeah, I think like one thing for me that I think about a lot is just how like the vast majority of my audience listening to this podcast is white, and like generally speaking, whether it's through television or podcasts, you know, like different group identities as a whole, similar to what we were saying earlier in the podcast, like identities stick together based on personal experience and what they can relate to. And I think in most cases that's a beautiful thing, with like the obvious exceptions being stuff like white nationalism and, you know, like literal neo-Nazis. But like just generally speaking, it's pretty normal that like people with similar interests and identities come together. But like what's interesting to me, at least in the past few years, like with this rise of these social media conversations and all that, is following certain people that have been really trying to bridge this divide. Like I think, like personally at least, like some of the ones I've followed, like there's been public friendships between people like Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates. I know like they've had a lot of conversations about like this topic and kind of bridging this racial divide. And trying to think, like Cornel West, he has this friend. He's a Princeton professor. I want to say his name is Robert something. I forget his last name. But yeah, he like Cornel West has this friend, and like they've also had a lot of these discussions over like the racial divide and so on, who it's like they're trying to actively showcase like what these conversations can look like for people. Because I mean, at some point we have to get better at having these conversations about race and just group identities in general across the spectrum. So like in your view, what are some things that just everyday people can be doing better in order to make these conversations more productive and accessible?
I mean, I am by no means a spokesperson for brown people, but I do think just by like opening yourself up to conversation. I feel so. I grew up also in the suburbs down in Atlanta, and I think the reason that I was exposed to so much is because like I knew so many different people. It was not so much that I only talked to like one group of people. It was that I knew, this person from this background over here, or this person from this background over there. And then my entire family is from the Caribbean. I have family in Europe. And I feel like just by understanding the differences in these people, and the nuances that come with different cultures, that kind of prepared me so that there was not this culture shock that happened when I met people who were different from me. And I feel like if more people kind of had that same, pattern, and the college is supposed to be that experience, but I feel like a lot of times we fall into the same tropes of hanging out with people that look and behave and act and think like you.
Right.
But yeah, I think just being open to conversation. I'm not talking about like having like race relation conversation, but like just general conversation, just like, how's your damn day? Like just general conversation. People who may not look like you, I feel like you would learn a lot, because I feel like at that point it humanizes them.
Yeah. And just like learning about each other's personal experiences, right?
Exactly. Then it's no longer, well, I saw this on BET, so I assume that's how Black people are. But now it's, or I had a Black friend who said yada, yada, yada. But just like diversifying your friend group and just understanding how, the differences and the nuances in different cultures, I feel like makes you a lot more understanding. And again, so there's not that, I didn't know that was wrong. I didn't know that, I couldn't say that, or whatever the case may be.
Right. Yeah, because there's so much of that today, like where there's still this like really weird series of growing pains, I guess you'd say, like where people are just stumbling through, like, I guess what's okay, what's not okay, like what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I think it's weird, too, how it all fits into the confines of, like, the greater culture wars. Because I feel like a lot of people that tend to lean right, I would say, like, as a whole, where people look at what you just said and kind of like this whole idea of, like, sharing, being more understanding of other people's experiences and all that. And I think some people look at that and they say, oh, well, like, what? So I'm not allowed to say this? Or, like they frame it in a way where it's, like, either about free speech or it's about, oh, like you're just offended over what I'm saying. And then it becomes this broader culture war and totally dilutes the waters of like what we're trying to accomplish here, which is literally just bridging the divide between everyday people. Because like I think if there's one area, like we've been talking about social media, if there's one area that social media has failed at, it's this one, I think, because people look at social media like as their primary lens with these conversations, because unless you live in a city or a diverse suburb, like you're not getting a lot of these conversations through a natural progression. Like you're not growing up and having it become like a natural part of your worldview, So like a lot of people are being, I guess, like their first experience is through social media, learning about this, and then they get caught into this cycle where there's these culture wars going on, and speech becomes weaponized in a way that really, I think, detracts from these interpersonal relationships that we're trying to create. Because, like, even, like, I'd love to hear your take on this. This is kind of off tangent. I wasn't thinking to throw this in there before, but now that we're here, like, I'd be interested to know, like, your thoughts on even just the word racism and the word racist, and, like, how, for me personally, the past few years and how, like, it's been used on social media, I think there's that kind of stereotypical trope that a lot of conservatives have, where they're like, well, if you don't agree with Black Lives Matter, everybody's calling you racist. And then it becomes this thing where the word racist has like a different meaning than I think a lot of people have traditionally understood it. Like people, it's almost like a personal prejudice definition and then an institutional definition, where like before, like I grew up, like my understanding of racism was just it's hatred of someone from another race in some way, shape, or form. And that was like, that could be black to white, that could be white to brown, that could be any various number of races. But like the way that racism as a term is communicated now through social media primarily is through an institutional lens, where it's like, it's more of like a power dynamic tied to it. So I'd be interested to know like your thoughts on that term and like how it's kind of evolved in the discourse.
And again, disclaimer, like these are just my personal thoughts. Of
course. Yeah.
But I would say, I would feel like we would have a better understanding of what that means if we knew our history. I think a lot of times people associate racist with, someone in a white hood and, a torch in their hand, burning crosses. But that's not always the case. I feel like there are microaggressions that can be, that need to be factored in, things like, asking to touch somebody, like touching somebody's hair without asking for permission initially, or even with me growing up, I've had to explain to people, and this is in my 20s, having to explain people why blackface is not okay, or why I speak, you speak so eloquently. I've never heard a black person speak like that. Things like that. And I feel like if we understood our history, like it was so much more than sit-ins and marches. And, I feel like a lot of our histories especially for black people specifically starts with slavery, ends with Martin Luther King. But I think if there was a deeper understanding, if there was a more broad knowledge of the history, I feel like that definition and that understanding would be a lot different, especially when it came to how we interacted with one another.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, especially granted how today the most prominent racists, how we would identify them, like your Richard Spencers, or even more recently, Stefan Molyneux, who's just an open white nationalist at this point. It is much more subtle in the sense that, it's not your white hoods. It's these, not just microaggressions, but it's how these people use rhetoric, race rhetoric, in really subversive and tricky ways, where especially toward younger kids who aren't as familiar with the lexicon, they're hearing certain terms being thrown around and certain language, and it's being used in a really malicious, racist way, but it's not obvious to them. There's an unpacking that people have to do to kind of be is this racist? I don't know. It doesn't sound racist at face value, but then you start to dig through the context, like you said, and be oh, this is the place where this phrase came from, or this is the place that this sentiment came from. And that's made, I think, just this conversation even more tricky nowadays on social media, because you have these people who are playing games like a Richard Spencer, who he gets to dress up in fancy suits, and he has a nice haircut, and he's college educated, and he talks well, and he sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And then you kind of dig in. There's this great interview he did with the progressive news host David Pakman from, I think it was a couple years ago now. And David Pakman basically just didn't let him get off on any of these really just straightforward questions, and he kept trying to skirt them, and they try to use these nuanced and tricky ways with their words to get around just outright saying I'm racist, because racist people, they won't say that. You're not gonna get David Duke to be I'm racist. That's not. And that's, I think, you're right. I think that's what especially most white people today, that's what they expect. If the person isn't outright saying, I hate black people, it's not an obvious enough thing for them to unwrap. And that's a huge problem in communicating this.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, like I said, just I think if we had a better understanding of what our history was, I think you would see the things that, that stems from there's a narrative that black people can't swim. But if you know the history of acid being thrown in pools and us being barred from being able to go to swimming pools, that might explain a little bit. So when you're making that joke with your friend, I think you would understand that it would be insensitive to make that joke, to make, to say that trope if you understood where that history came from.
Yeah, it's not just they're trying to stifle my free speech. It's no, you're just being an asshole. But right. Yeah, I think okay, so from your perspective, we've been going on for a little while here, and I really, really appreciate all your time and your insights. This has been really, really cool. I just want to get a couple more questions in, if that's cool with you. Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I'm wondering, just kind of going through all of what we're talking about here, just generally speaking, do you find these types of conversations to be helpful and energizing, or more exhausting and really difficult to have?
I think they're only exhausting when the party that you're speaking to has an agenda of not wanting to hear you. It's more so I'm I'm talking, like I'm listening so I can speak back, not necessarily for me to absorb the information. So that's when it becomes exhausting, when it becomes this runaround of me explaining several times, several different ways, and you're coming back and negating it every single time. Not necessarily because there is something to negate, but because it doesn't fit in with the ideologies that you have. I feel like that becomes exhausting in my personal experience. But on one side, it's tough because like you don't want to be the person who's constantly having to speak on behalf of brown people or people that look like you. But on the other side, it's like if you're given a platform, like, to continue to make sure that you're bridging the gap so that, there's that understanding, you do it. So I think there's two sides to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, do you tend to get into these types of conversations on social media, or do you kind of shy away and focus on your work?
I do not get into these conversations on social media because I used to. Let me not say that I've never. I used to. And what I notice is that a lot of people who approach you about these conversations they don't genuinely want to understand, the nuances and the differences. It's more so I am trying to prove you wrong. I'm trying to debunk your truth. And I feel like, that's where I was just like, well, it's not worth me having these conversations if every time you're either going to block me for proving something that you're upset because you didn't have a link from anywhere except for Breitbart to prove your point. Or it's a situation where like you've resorted to name calling or things like that. So like, as far as social media, I'll stay in the comment section and I'll read and be in the mix, but I don't necessarily want to contribute to that just because of like how ugly it can get in person. Absolutely. I'll have the conversation, referencing back to the person that had asked me about blackface or it asked me to explain my ability to speak proper English. That was a conversation that I was, it was a sit down where I had to be like, this is not okay. And this is why.
Yeah.
So a lot easier than it would have been online because I feel like when you see someone, they become a human to you. And it's just like, I see what she's saying.
Right.
Now I understand why she feels what she feels.
Yeah, I'm interested to know that just because, like, I have a few friends. I mean, like, there's this one guy I follow on Facebook primarily. His name's Andre Henry, and he does a lot of just social media posts and live videos on like race, inequality, and like faith-based stuff. And recently, I've been following a lot of his posts, and it's been interesting, like how his entire approach to this conversation recently has been like this whole topic is just exhausting to him for the exact reasons that you just laid out, where it's like he does these posts every day. Like he might go live, he might write an article, he might write a Facebook status, and he's interacting with people constantly around this topic, and he's constantly bombarded with people. Like you said, it's not necessarily people who are even, I guess you'd say, outright disagreeing or being racist necessarily. It's just people who are intentionally putting rhetoric in the way of what he's trying to say about his experience, and they're doing it in a way that's basically like basically invalidating what he's saying while he's trying to explain his experience. It's like he's been saying recently, it's like it's so exhausting having to educate white people on my experience and on the black experience when they could just be going to their local libraries or talking to their friends and reading on this and having conversations about it. And I'm forced to be in a position where it's like this is his work, and he's now having to respond to all these people who it's almost like they're intentionally missing the point. And that I just can't even imagine like how, like when I think personally, it's like not even around race. Like I'm just trying to think like we're both social media people. So if I were to be posting my takes on social media, like my experience as a social media manager, and on a daily basis I was getting an influx of people constantly just like dismembering my takes and being like, oh no, it's not really like that, or no, you don't really know, or have you ever considered that maybe it's this way and not that way? Like after a while I'd be like, what is the point? Like why are all you people so hell-bent on just like stepping in with your 2 cents when all I'm doing is trying to share my experience. So I was just curious to know, like, from your perspective, because I know that this conversation has been going on for years at this point on social media, and it really does seem like for a lot of people it's just gotten to be exhausting insofar as like how we can communicate this like divide between people.
For me, and this goes back to like who I follow on social media, I actually will not engage in a conversation where I feel like neither party is willing to learn. You know, parties are very settled in how they feel. And now I'm just here, like you said, to just dismember your argument. Regardless of if it's a personal experience or if it's like backed up with facts or whatever it is, I won't engage because it is draining. It is exhausting. And I feel like at that point, the intentions there are not honest intentions to understand. So I won't engage with those ones. And that goes for race, feminism, hair texture, colorism, you know, like whatever the case may be. If I'm telling you that this is my truth, and that's another side to it, you have to take everybody's truth as their own. I think sometimes there can be a logic of this person because she, is part of the LGBT community, that she is a spokesperson for them.
Right.
When in reality, she's telling her stance, her what's happened to her, or like how she sees things. And I feel like you have to take that into account when absorbing information from another person.
Yeah, right. It's like we're caught in between this weird world where on one hand we have to, just because we're human beings, and like we've been saying, we naturally identify in groups and categories, and we have to be able to sort of generalize things to a degree. And like we can generalize certain people groups when talking about whether it's statistics or when you have a lot of people coming together and they all agree on one thing. It's like, okay, we can use that data, we can use those group experiences, but at the end of the day, I think ultimately it does come down to individuals. Like you have to kind of, like it's been funny, like you keep reiterating, like you aren't speaking on behalf of the brown community. Like this is your personal take, like this is your opinion. And I think that's important. It sucks that you even have to reiterate that, but it is like important in today's culture because there's this constant tugging back and forth between, we speak in these generalities, which I think is helpful in some situations, but I think when it comes to personal interactions and like how we learn from each other, like we do have to bring it back to a personal level and not generalize our biases and generalize like our perception of a group onto every white person or black person or social media manager or whatever it might be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you so we can wind it down here. Like I'm given all of this chaos and like everything we've been talking about, like do you personally see yourself being active on social media in the next few years? Like I know it's your job right now, but I'm sure like progressively, like we've been saying with hustle culture and how things keep moving faster and faster, I'm sure it's been driving you crazy to a certain point.
Honestly, I saw somebody throw a piece of cheese at a baby, and I think I'm done with this shit, to be completely honest. I'm done.
Social media is canceled.
No, I think it's nice to be able to connect with people, but I was actually listening to a podcast, The Art of Manliness, where somebody, and I can't remember the person's name, but on the podcast they talked about detoxing yourself from social media. And I know there's probably people like me out there who are social media managers being like, well, I'm a social media manager. Obviously, I can't detox. When in reality, you can. So the parameters that they set up that I've kind of put into practice for myself is, from, give yourself certain hours where you're on social. And then outside of that, like do what you like to do and like step away from the chaos of social media. And I feel like that's been incredibly helpful for me. So like, I don't see myself stepping away from social media completely because how do you be a social media manager and not be part of social?
Right.
But I do feel like it's worth just kind of like regrouping within yourself and, kind of having a meeting within yourself, being like, okay, like now it's time for us to take our break and step away. The news that broke, it's fine. It'll be there tomorrow. It'll be there when you get to it in a couple hours, like the world is not waiting with bated breath on what you have to say about the topic. Just give yourself that breathing room and that space.
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's like sometimes I just feel like I'm getting old so quick, even though I'm still so young, because on social media, it just moves so fast. And it's like, I am hopeful too, in the sense, like, I don't plan to be off social media necessarily, but I am hopeful that people like us or people in our general age category will get to the point in the next few years or the next decade where we've matured enough to know our boundaries and to know when we should insert our 2 cents or our time onto the platforms and when we should pull back. Because right now, it does feel like we're in this like guinea pig stage where it's so easy just to get caught in the cycle. Like even like for me personally, this podcast has been a great way to kind of force myself out of being able to even look at my phone. Like I'm just talking to you right now. We don't have cell phones in front of us. Like this is like a pure uninterrupted conversation. And even just stuff like that, like meeting friends for coffee or, like taking a nap, going on a walk without your phone, like whatever it might be. I feel like that stuff is so important to integrate into our lives because it does get to the point where like if I'm at work and I'm working on my laptop and then I go to the bathroom, I'm checking my phone, like if I'm going to lunch, I'm checking my phone, and it's like it never turns off. And I feel like that is just so, that entire attitude and habit like forming thing is just so unhealthy, and hopefully we can mature and get past all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that I've read reports before that have said like it's legitimately an addiction. And I feel like I can only see like the attachment to electronics and social like getting worse. Here comes my cynicism again. So I feel like to kind of be like ahead of the curve, like that's where you cut off like, okay, I'm not watching or I'm not being on my phone from this time. Like I've started a new initiative, like going to bed without my phone. Like I don't sleep with my phone next to my bed anymore.
Oh, I love that.
And it has made my mornings so much more peaceful because now I wake up and it's not that I'm checking my phone to see, 15 alerts from, the news sites that I follow. Now it's just kind of like, how do you want to start your day? What initiatives do you have for the day other than, the news cycle deciphering that for you?
I need to do that. I literally have my phone plugged in next to my bed on a dresser that's like, I don't know, like 4.5 feet tall. And my bed is next to it. And I literally wake up to my alarm and grab the cord and swing it like a mace onto my lap, and then open up my social media apps as soon as my eyes open sometimes. And it's like the dumbest habit. I'm like, why do I do this? But I can't stop doing it.
It's insane. I want to at one point get to the point where like my mom is, where like she sleeps with her phone in the kitchen. Like there's no getting to it. She'll text us and be like, hey, my phone is off for the night, so like call the house phone or call the police if you need an emergency.
Your mom is goals. That's it.
Like I'm going to bed.
It's right as of now, like when you're offline and you're not working, like what are some of your favorite things to be spending your time on?
Oh my goodness. I am an avid reader. I advocate for books all day long. I think everybody should be reading books. I also love podcasts, and I feel like it's an alternate way for me to like consume information without feeling like this is like my space is being invaded, So like I just got done listening to like Slow Burn about the Monica Lewinsky case, and that was it was just such a great feeling to be able to just put my phone in my pocket, put my headphones on, and just for like an hour and some change, just space out and like hear the story that's happening and to get a better understanding of that history. Also like just like hanging out with my dog. I got a 15-year-old pup. She's pretty cool. So hanging out, just kicking it with, it's fun too.
Oh, I love that. So we can wind it down here. Again, Kimeko, I really appreciate all the time and the insights and just you conversing all these really difficult topics. I know I hit you with some questions that are like the type of questions where you're like, oh, are we trying to like solve all the world's problems right now? And obviously there's like no easy answer for any of them. I appreciate you hanging in with all that. Like, I mean, obviously we can end here. Like, I know you've got a range of skills and interests and you're super young in your career. So like, as of now, are there any areas or industries that you see yourself growing into the next few years, like just outside of advertising and journalism? Or do you think this is like the space you want to develop in?
I've always said that I wanted to be like a writer to tell these stories, but I think I would like to see myself coming into a role of, because I've been provided so many opportunities. I've been afforded so many opportunities to be able to be in spaces where typically you don't see people like me. I want to be able to kind of pass that torch. I want to be in a position where I can pass that torch. As far as careers, I don't know what that would take or where that would lead me, but I want to be able to be somebody who's able to open doors for other people who are different.
I love that. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much again for your time, Kimeko. Was there anything that you wanted to add? Anything you've got going on you want me to point people to or anything?
I wish I had a SoundCloud right now. I don't.
You plug your SoundCloud.
I wish I had a SoundCloud link. But yeah, no. If you want any more of my hot takes, you can follow me on Twitter, where I put all my trash opinions about things. It's at Kimeko M. And then if you're in advertising, Adweek is your best bet as far as like information. We're actually headed to South by Southwest here pretty soon, and my team is going to have some incredible stories coming out of there, so stay tuned.
Beautiful. Thanks so much again for the time, Kimeko, and I'll be sure to catch all your hot takes on Twitter.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.